The crisp morning air carried a gentle chill, the kind that makes you pull your jacket a little tighter but also fills your lungs with an invigorating freshness. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and the world felt quiet, almost holding its breath. Out in the sprawling fields, a low mist clung to the ground like a ghostly blanket, curling around the weathered wooden fences that lined the pastures. Somewhere in the distance, the soft nicker of a horse echoed, a comforting sound for anyone who understood the bond between humans and these majestic animals. For her, though, that sound wasn't comforting anymore. It was a reminder. A reminder of the day her life had changed in an instant, the day fear had replaced joy, and confidence had given way to doubt. She stood there now, boots firmly planted in the damp grass, her hands trembling slightly even though they were shoved deep into her pockets. The stables, once her sanctuary, now loomed in the distance like a specter of her past, casting long shadows across her mind. She hadn't set foot here in months, not since the accident. The accident. It was a word she hated because it was too small, too plain to describe the storm of emotions and pain it had left behind. One moment, she was flying, her horse's hooves pounding against the dirt, her heart soaring with the wind rushing past her ears. The next, the world had turned upside down. There had been a sickening thud, the sharp pain that seemed to radiate through her entire body, and then darkness. She could still hear the echo of that fall in her mind, could still feel the ground rushing up to meet her every time she closed her eyes. Her horse had been spooked by something that day, a flash of movement in the trees, maybe, or a sudden noise. It didn't matter now. All she knew was that she hit the ground hard, and when she woke up in the hospital, everything felt different. The doctors told her she was lucky, it could have been worse. But no one warned her about the fear that would settle in, a heavy weight in her chest, making it hard to even think about riding again. The mere thought of climbing back into a saddle made her palms sweat and her heart race. And yet here she was, back at the stables. Not because she wanted to be, but because she had to be. Her horse needed her, and deep down, some part of her still needed him too. He had been her partner, her friend, her confidant. He had been everything before the fall. But now, standing in the shadow of that barn, she wondered if they could ever find their way back to each other. Could she ever trust him again? Could she ever trust herself? She took a tentative step forward, the gravel crunching under her boots. Her horse was in the far paddock, his sleek coat glinting faintly in the early morning light. He lifted his head as she approached, his ears flicking forward in recognition. Her heart ached at the sight of him, so strong, so beautiful, and yet so unknowable. Did he remember that day too? Did he carry the same scars she did, invisible but ever present? She stopped a few feet from the fence, her breath catching in her throat. He watched her with those deep, soulful eyes, and for a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. But then she felt it again, that creeping fear, the voice in the back of her mind whispering all the things that could go wrong. She wanted to turn around, to walk away, but something about the way he looked at her held her there, frozen in place. Suddenly he moved. It wasn't the kind of movement she expected, no nervous prancing or spooked shying. Instead, he walked toward her, his steps deliberate and calm. Her pulse quickened as he reached the fence, his head lowering slightly as if to meet her halfway. She didn't know what to do. Should she reach out? Should she step back? Her hands stayed at her sides, clenched into fists, as she fought against the fear threatening to overwhelm her. But then he did something she didn't expect. Something that stopped her thoughts in their tracks and made her blink in surprise. He leaned his head over the fence and nudged her gently, his soft muzzle brushing against her shoulder. It was such a small gesture, so simple and yet so profound. In that moment, it was as if he was telling her, "I'm still here. I'm still me. And I'm not giving up on you." Her breath hitched, and she felt a lump rise in her throat. The tears came before she could stop them, spilling over as she reached up to touch his face. His warmth, his solid presence, was so real, so grounding. For the first time in months, she felt something other than fear. It wasn't quite hope, not yet, but it was close. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if she'd ever be able to ride again, or if the bond they once had could ever be fully repaired. But in that quiet, misty morning, with her horse standing there as if to remind her of everything they'd shared, she realized one thing. She wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to take the first step. Her hand lingered on his face, her fingers brushing against the soft fur of his muzzle. It was almost as if the world around them had stilled, holding its breath just like she was. The air smelled faintly of hay and damp earth, a scent she used to associate with happiness, with hours spent riding trails that seemed to stretch on forever. But now, it felt heavier, burdened with memories she wasn't ready to face. She pulled her hand back, wiping at her eyes quickly, as though embarrassed that she'd let herself cry in front of him. He didn't seem to mind. He just stood there, watching her, waiting. She glanced over her shoulder at the barn, wondering if anyone had seen her standing there like this, frozen and unsure. There had been a time when she had been so confident, almost fearless. Riding had been her escape, her joy, her way of shutting out everything else in the world. People used to tell her she had a natural gift, that she was born to ride. But if that were true, then why did she feel like a stranger now, not just to the stables but to herself? Her horse let out a low, soft breath, almost a sigh, and it startled her out of her thoughts. She looked back at him, studying his face as though she might find answers written there. He had always been calm, steady, the kind of horse you could trust with anything. That was why the accident had been such a shock. It wasn't like him to bolt, to panic like that. She hadn't seen it coming, hadn't even had time to react. And now, every time she thought about it, her chest tightened with the same helplessness she'd felt in those seconds before the fall. She found herself speaking before she even realized the words were forming. Her voice was quiet, almost shaky, as if she weren't sure she wanted him to hear her. "Why did you do it?" she asked. The question hung in the air, absurd in its simplicity. She knew he couldn't answer, not in words, but the question still burned inside her. She needed to understand. She needed to know if it was something she had done wrong or if it had been something else entirely. Was there something she had missed? Some sign she hadn't seen? The breeze picked up slightly, rustling the leaves in the nearby trees, and she wrapped her arms around herself instinctively. It wasn't cold exactly, but the chill in the air seemed to seep deeper, settling somewhere beneath her skin. She knew she couldn't just stand there forever. She had come back for a reason, even if she wasn't entirely sure what that reason was. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was hope that she could somehow fix what had been broken. With a deep breath, she took another step closer to him. Her heart was pounding, and she hated how weak it made her feel. She used to walk up to him without a second thought, running her hands over his neck, whispering to him as though he were the only one who could truly understand her. But now every movement felt deliberate, measured, as though one wrong step might shatter whatever fragile connection they still had. He didn't move as she reached out again, her hand trembling slightly as she placed it against his neck. His coat was warm beneath her touch, and she could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing. It was strange how something so simple could feel so monumental. She let her fingers trail along his neck, remembering the way she used to do this without even thinking. It was like muscle memory, but it felt distant now, like it belonged to someone else. She tried to push the thoughts away, focusing instead on the moment, on the way his ears flicked toward her, and the way his eyes seemed to soften. It was almost as if he was trying to tell her something, but she couldn't quite figure out what it was. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe the fact that he was still here, still willing to let her near him, was enough for now. The sound of footsteps behind her made her jump, and she turned quickly, her hand dropping to her side. One of the stable hands was walking toward her, his expression curious but not unkind. "Didn't think I'd see you out here today," he said, his voice light but careful, as though he didn't want to scare her off. She forced a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, well, I figured it was time," she said, her voice trailing off awkwardly. She didn't know how to explain what had brought her back, and she wasn't sure she wanted to. The stable hand nodded, his gaze shifting to her horse. "He's missed you, you know," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Every time someone else tries to ride him, he acts up. Like he's waiting for you." She swallowed hard, the words hitting her harder than she expected. She looked back at her horse, her chest tightening again. Was that true? Had he really been waiting for her, even after everything? The thought was almost too much to bear, and she found herself blinking back tears once more. "I don't know if I can do it," she admitted quietly, more to herself than to him. "I don't know if I can ride again." The stable hand didn't answer right away, and when he did, his voice was calm, steady. "You don't have to decide that today," he said. "But you're here. That's a start." She nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed him. Being here didn't feel like enough. It felt like a drop in an ocean of doubt and fear. But as she stood there, her horse still watching her with that quiet patience, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she could take another step. Not today, and maybe not tomorrow, but someday. For now, though, all she could do was stand there, the past and the present swirling around her like the mist in the air. The fear was still there, heavy and unrelenting, but so was something else. Something quieter, but no less real. It wasn't hope, not yet. But it was close. The stable hand moved back a few steps, sensing the weight of the moment. He didn't press her to talk, didn't try to push her into any decision she wasn't ready to make. He simply stood there, his hands resting at his sides, his eyes on the horse. She was grateful for that. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, filled with unspoken words that neither of them could quite bring themselves to say. She glanced down at the ground, the grass beneath her boots glistening with dew. The world felt muted, as though everything was holding its breath, waiting for her. Her gaze shifted back to the horse. He had turned his head, as if to look out across the field, but his body remained steady, his hooves planted firmly in the soft earth. She couldn't help but wonder if he was more than just a horse in that moment. He was a symbol, wasn't he? A symbol of all the things she used to be, all the things she still wanted to be, but couldn't seem to reach. Every time she tried to step forward, her mind swirled with the fear of falling, of making another mistake, of letting herself down again. What if she failed him? What if, the next time she tried to ride, everything went wrong? What if she froze up again, unable to trust her own body? It wasn't just about riding anymore. It was about everything, the way her confidence had shattered, the way she had second-guessed every decision since the accident. The fear had grown like a shadow, following her everywhere, twisting and distorting the world around her. Sometimes it felt like it was all she could see. Her thoughts spiraled out of control, and she didn't know how to stop them. She wanted to be strong, wanted to push through, but the weight of her fear was overwhelming. Every time she thought about the possibility of getting back on the saddle, her heart would race, and her breath would catch in her throat. She had once ridden without a second thought, as if the world was hers to conquer. But now, even the idea of climbing back onto a horse felt like an insurmountable mountain. The horse shifted slightly, his ears flicking in her direction again, as if he were trying to understand the turmoil inside her. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. It wasn't his fault. He wasn't the one who had panicked, who had thrown her to the ground. But somehow, in her mind, he had become tied to the accident, to the fear that had taken root inside her. Every time she looked at him, she couldn't help but remember the terror, the helplessness. She wanted to believe that things could go back to the way they were, but a part of her wasn't sure if she could ever erase the memory of that fall. Her hand tightened around the railing of the fence. She couldn't keep living like this, unable to move forward, unable to heal. But how could she move past something like that? How could she let go of the fear that had gripped her so tightly, that still gnawed at the edges of her mind every day? "You know, you don't have to ride him," the stable hand said quietly, almost as if reading her thoughts. "Not yet, at least. Just being here, spending time with him, that's enough." She turned to face him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "But what if it's not enough?" she asked. Her voice felt strange, like she hadn't spoken in days. "What if I never get over this? What if I can't ride again?" The stable hand met her gaze, his expression calm, unruffled. "Then you don't have to. You've been through something difficult, something no one should have to face. But that doesn't mean you have to rush. Healing doesn't have a timeline." His words echoed in her mind long after he had walked away, leaving her alone with the horse once more. Healing. It was such a simple word, but the reality of it seemed so far out of reach. Could she heal? Could she ever feel safe again, feel confident again, or was the person she had been gone forever, replaced by someone who was too afraid to take that next step? She didn't know. And maybe that was the hardest part. The not knowing. For the rest of the morning, she stayed with him, sitting on the fence and just watching. He grazed peacefully nearby, every so often looking up at her with those steady eyes. It was as if he were waiting for something, waiting for her to decide whether she would return to him, whether they could still be partners, or whether this was the end of the road for them. She couldn't bring herself to reach out and climb into the saddle, but neither could she walk away. Every part of her screamed for resolution, for some kind of closure, but she knew deep down that there were no easy answers here. As the sun climbed higher in sky, the mist began to lift, revealing the full expanse of the fields beyond the stables. The world was coming to life again, but she felt trapped in her own hesitation, stuck in middle of a decision she wasn't ready to make. What if she never found the courage? What if this moment was as far as she could go? The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. The stable hands went about their work, tending to other horses, cleaning stalls, and mucking out the paddocks. She stayed in background, watching, listening, not really participating but also not leaving. Every now and then, her horse would glance her way, as if to check that she was still there. The bond they had shared was still there, lingering just beneath the surface, but it felt fragile, like it could shatter with the slightest movement. When the evening came, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink, she knew it was time to leave. The fear, the doubt, and the uncertainty had not gone away. But neither had the small, quiet voice that whispered within her, telling her she wasn't finished yet, that maybe tomorrow she would be ready to take the next step. The days that followed were a blur of uncertainty. She spent more time at the stables, but the fear never left her. It clung to her like a second skin, always there, lurking just beneath the surface. She watched her horse from a distance, but every time she moved closer, the weight in her chest grew heavier. There were moments when she thought she might be ready, when she caught herself reaching for the saddle, her hand trembling but determined. But then something would shift inside her, a rush of panic, and she would pull back. The thought of getting on that horse again, of trusting him after everything, felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that the ground beneath her might crumble at any moment. The stable was quieter that afternoon than it had been in days. A storm was coming, the wind picking up and rustling through the trees. She stood in the corner of the barn, leaning against the wall, watching the sky darken as the clouds gathered. The tension in the air was palpable, as though nature itself was holding its breath. She didn't know why she'd come today, maybe hoping that the stillness would give her clarity, or maybe hoping that somehow, today, the fear would finally subside. But as the wind howled outside, it felt like the world was closing in on her, the noise growing louder, more insistent, just like storm inside her mind. She glanced toward the paddock, where her horse was grazing calmly, his coat glistening in the muted light. His presence, so steady, so familiar, almost made her feel like everything could be okay. He looked at her, his dark eyes soft, as if he could sense the turmoil inside her. But there was a weight in her heart that couldn't be shaken off. The more she watched him, the more she questioned herself. Could she really do it? Could she face her fear, climb onto his back, and ride as if nothing had happened? The thought made her stomach twist in knots. As the wind picked up, the barn door creaked open with a loud bang, startling her from her thoughts. She turned quickly, her heart skipping a beat, and saw one of the stable hands rushing inside, his face tight with concern. "There's something wrong with the horses in the far paddock," he said, his voice urgent. "They're spooked, acting out of control." Her pulse quickened. She hadn't been expecting this, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The stable hand was already turning to head back outside, but he paused when he saw her standing there, looking lost. "We need help. You're only one who can calm them down." Her throat went dry, the words hanging in the air, as though they were meant for someone else. She wanted to say no. She wanted to back away, retreat into the safety of the barn and the quiet comfort of her uncertainty. But something inside her shifted, a flicker of resolve. She hadn't come all this way just to walk away. Not now. Not when she was so close. The fear was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, but there was something else too, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe it was the familiar rush, the call of the horses, the instinct to step up when needed. Maybe it was something deeper, something more primal that told her this was her moment. Without thinking, she moved quickly toward the paddock. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and she felt every step as if the ground itself was testing her resolve. She could feel the wind picking up, the storm almost upon them, the air heavy with tension. As she reached the gate, she could hear the frantic sounds of hooves pounding the ground, the frantic cries of the horses as they tore through the field. The sight was chaotic, horses running in all directions, their eyes wide with fear, their bodies tense and wired. Her chest tightened as she watched them, her mind racing. And then, her horse appeared. He stood at the edge of the paddock, his dark eyes locked onto hers. For a moment, everything else disappeared, the storm, the chaos, the fear. It was just her and him, the bond they shared, fragile and unspoken, but real. The other horses continued to panic, but he stood still, calm in the midst of the storm. She couldn't explain why, but something inside her shifted in that moment. It was as if he was telling her that he was ready, that he still trusted her, that they could still do this together. Without a second thought, she moved toward him. The stable hand called out to her, but she didn't hear him. She didn't hear anything except the sound of her own heartbeat, pounding in her ears. Her hands shook as she reached for the reins, but she didn't hesitate this time. She didn't pull away. She slid the reins over his head and took a deep breath, her fingers curling around the leather, grounding herself in the feel of it. Everything was quiet. The wind seemed to still for just a moment, the chaos of the other horses fading into the background. She was there with him, her horse, the one she had once trusted with her whole heart. He was calm, his head low, his breathing steady. For a moment, everything felt like it was exactly as it should be. But the calm was fleeting. One of the other horses let out a loud whinny, the sound sharp and jarring, and before she could react, the horse nearest to her bucked wildly, its hooves pounding against the ground. Her horse tensed, his body shifting beneath her, and for a moment, everything seemed to unravel. She felt her grip on the reins tighten, her heart racing again. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She wasn't ready. She wasn't sure she could do this. The fear came rushing back, flooding her chest, her mind screaming for her to stop. But the moment she hesitated, her horse shifted again, this time more urgently, as if sensing the tension in her. He moved closer, his breath warm against her skin, and in that instant, something clicked. Her hands steadied. She didn't fight him. She didn't try to control him. She simply let him guide her. The reins were still in her hands, but it was as if they were no longer the thing that held them together. It was him, steady and sure, his body beneath her, a constant reminder that trust could still be rebuilt, that the past didn't have to define them. The storm, both outside and within her, raged around them, but for the first time in so long, she felt something stir in her heart. But just as she thought she was gaining control, everything changed. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Just as she thought she was gaining control, something shifted, something unexpected. The storm, which had seemed distant moments ago, suddenly intensified, the wind picking up with alarming force. The sky darkened even further, and the first few heavy drops of rain began to fall, splattering against her skin like cold needles. The horses, already skittish, reacted violently, their panic escalating in an instant. Her horse, despite his calm demeanor moments before, shifted uneasily beneath her, his muscles tensing as the wind howled through the trees. For a split second, everything seemed to slow down. The barn door banged open again, and the sound of hooves pounding across the field grew louder. A sharp, urgent whinny broke through the chaos, followed by the terrifying sound of something crashing against the fence. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned quickly to see one of the larger horses, a stallion, known for his unpredictable nature, had broken free from the paddock. His eyes were wild, his body trembling with fear, and he was charging straight toward them. Time seemed to stretch as she watched the stallion approach, his hooves kicking up the earth with every frantic step. The barn door swung wildly in the wind, making the whole scene feel like a nightmare. The other horses, too frightened to settle, began to circle, their movements erratic and panicked. Her horse jerked beneath her, sensing the danger, and she tightened her grip on the reins instinctively. But the stallion was closing in fast, his wild gaze locked onto hers, and there was no time to second-guess her instincts. Everything in her told her to move, to get out of the way, but she couldn't. She couldn't leave the horse she had once trusted. She couldn't abandon him when he was already so close, so ready to return to her. But the stakes were higher now, far higher than they had ever been. She felt the familiar knot of fear in her stomach, that tightening, suffocating grip that had plagued her for weeks, but she couldn't give in this time. Not when it mattered. Not when the storm was threatening to swallow everything around them. As the stallion charged, her heart raced. She could hear the thunder growing louder, feel the air shift as the storm picked up. She felt the pressure in her chest, the weight of the decision that loomed over her like a dark cloud. Should she stay, try to calm her horse, and hope that everything would settle? Or should she take a risk, move fast, and get her horse to safety before the stallion caused irreversible damage? Before she could decide, the stallion veered sharply, his massive body slamming into the side of the fence. The force of the impact was enough to send a shockwave through the ground beneath her feet. Her horse reared up, startled by the violent sound, and she fought to keep her balance. The reins slipped slightly in her hands, and she felt her body move with the rhythm of her horse, trying to regain control in the rising chaos. Then, just as suddenly as the storm had started, the stallion turned. He was headed directly toward them, his body a blur of fear and raw power. Everything in her screamed to jump down, to run to safety, but her body wouldn't listen. She was frozen in place, unable to tear her gaze away from the stampeding beast. The world had narrowed down to just her horse, and the chaos rapidly closing in. Her horse, sensing the danger even more acutely than she was, bolted forward without hesitation. She tried to hold him back, but he was already moving, his hooves pounding against the dirt, the rhythm growing faster with each passing second. The other horses, still frantic, were beginning to charge in different directions, adding to the sense of madness in the air. The storm's intensity grew, the wind pushing against her with each step, and the ground beneath her feet began to tremble, as if the entire world was about to break apart. The stallion was close now, close enough that she could see the wildness in his eyes. His neck was arched, his nostrils flaring with each desperate breath. And then, just as the world seemed to tilt on its axis, the ground beneath her horse shifted, as if some invisible force had sent a shock through the earth. Her horse stumbled, his legs giving out beneath him, and for a heart-stopping moment, it felt as though everything was falling apart. She heard a scream, hers or the stallion's, she couldn't tell, and she felt herself being thrown forward, her body hurtling through the air. In the split second before she hit the ground, everything seemed to freeze. She felt weightless, as if time had stopped altogether. The sound of the storm, the thundering hooves, the frantic cries of the horses, they all disappeared, leaving her suspended in a moment that felt as if it could last forever. And then, the world came rushing back with a brutal force. She landed hard, her body hitting the ground with an agonizing thud. Pain shot up her spine, and she gasped, the wind knocked out of her. The world spun around her as she tried to gather her senses, but the panic was starting to creep back in. Her vision blurred, and her heart was hammering so loudly that she couldn't hear anything except the thunder of her pulse. Her horse had stopped. She could hear his breathing, ragged and strained, but the stallion, where was he? Her thoughts were scattered, each one trying to make sense of what had just happened. Her hand reached out instinctively, finding the dirt beneath her fingers, and she pushed herself up, wincing with the effort. She couldn't focus on the pain. She had to focus on the danger. She had to get up. She had to. A shadow loomed over her. The stallion was standing there, his body still trembling from the chaos. His eyes were wild, but there was something else there too. Something unexpected. And then, just as she thought she couldn't face another second of the madness, a sound broke through the tension, the unmistakable sound of hooves approaching at a calm, measured pace. Her heart skipped. Could it be? In the midst of the storm, her horse had returned. He was moving toward her, slow and deliberate, his presence more powerful than the chaos around them. Could it be that he had heard her call? Or was it something deeper? Something she wasn't ready to understand yet? She couldn't afford to waste another moment. The tension in the air was thick, heavier than the storm swirling overhead. The stallion, standing tall with his wide, frantic eyes, seemed to measure every step she took. His muscles rippled under the rein, his breath shallow and fast. It was as if the entire world had turned into a battle between fear and trust. Every heartbeat felt like a countdown. But something inside her clicked. This was it. This was the moment that would define everything. She tried to stand, but the pain in her side was overwhelming. She gasped, the breath catching in her throat as she struggled to rise. The stallion, sensing her vulnerability, took another step forward, and her heart thudded in her chest, a wave of panic flooding her mind. She had to move. She couldn't let herself be caught in this moment of weakness. But just as the world seemed to close in on her, she heard it. The soft, rhythmic sound of hooves, the steady pace that had been absent for what felt like forever. Her horse, the one she'd been so afraid to trust, was making his way toward her, calm and determined, his steady presence cutting through the chaos. His eyes locked onto hers as he neared, his head low, almost as if he was asking her to rise with him. The panic from moments before seemed to dissolve with each step he took, the connection they shared undeniable. Without thinking, her hands reached out toward him, and when he was close enough, she pushed herself up from the ground, using the strength in her legs to climb onto his back. The instant she was in the saddle, it felt as though everything settled into place. The fear, the chaos, the uncertainty, they all seemed to fade into the background. Her horse stood still beneath her, his breath steady, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to trust him completely. The bond between them was undeniably stronger now, perhaps, than it had ever been. She ran her fingers through his mane, the rain running down her face, mixing with the tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. And then the stallion charged. The sound of hooves pounding the earth grew louder, the wild animal rushing toward them like a storm. Her heart raced in her chest as she gripped the reins, but she didn't back down. She wouldn't. Not now. Her horse, sensing the threat, reared up just as the stallion closed the distance. In that instant, she felt a surge of power, as if she and her horse were one, working in perfect harmony. The stallion, wild and untamed, veered sharply, but it was too late. Her horse, with a force and precision she hadn't expected, lunged forward, pushing the stallion off course. For a moment, everything seemed to pause. The rain, the wind, the frantic pounding of hooves, they all stopped. And then, the stallion, disoriented and shaken, veered off into the distance, his wild eyes disappearing into the mist of the storm. Her heart still raced, but the danger had passed. She and her horse stood in the middle of the storm, alive, unbroken. But just as relief began to wash over her, something even stranger happened. She turned her head to look toward the edge of the paddock where the stallion had been. There, standing in the shadows, was another figure, a person, drenched in rain, their face obscured by the heavy storm. For a moment, her heart skipped a beat, unsure if she was imagining things. The person moved closer, and as they came into view, her breath caught in her throat. It was the stable hand, the one who had called her earlier, but now there was something different about him. His expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. She could feel the weight of his gaze, and the unsettling sense that there was something more to this storm, something that had been hidden all along. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say a word, the stable hand spoke first, his voice low and steady. "You did it," he said, his words strange and almost knowing. But that was just the beginning. Her mind raced as she tried to process what he meant. What did he mean by that? What was really going on here? She thought the storm, the chaos, the fear, everything had come to an end, but now it felt like something else was beginning. The feeling in her gut, the one that had been tugging at her all along, was stronger than ever. Something was off. Before she could ask another question, the stable hand's expression shifted. He turned and walked toward the barn, his back to her as he disappeared into the shadows. "There's more you need to understand," he called over his shoulder, his words hanging in the air, heavy with mystery. Her horse snorted, tugging at the reins as if urging her to follow. She looked down at him, her heart still pounding, unsure of what to make of the strange encounter. The storm raged on, the wind still howling through the trees, but the threat seemed to have passed. Or so she thought. But deep down, she couldn't shake feeling that the real story had only just begun. The storm had subsided, but something darker, more mysterious, was waiting just beyond the horizon. As she spurred her horse into motion, the world around her seemed to shift again. She was no longer sure of what lay ahead, but one thing was certain: whatever was coming, she wasn't going to face it alone. And that realization made the storm seem like nothing more than a whisper in the distance. The night was far from over, and as the wind continued to howl around her, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was still amiss. The storm, though calmer now, still lingered in the air, and the unease in her gut wouldn't dissipate. She urged her horse forward, unsure of what to expect but unable to ignore the strange pull that urged her toward the barn where the stable hand had vanished. The barn loomed ahead, its silhouette faintly illuminated by the dim light of the lanterns scattered around the property. She hesitated for only a moment before guiding her horse through the gates and toward the shadowed entrance. The rain had started to lighten, leaving the ground slick and muddy beneath the hooves. Her mind was swirling with questions, but her heart was heavy with a strange resolve. She needed answers. As she approached the barn, the stable hand's figure reappeared at the doorway, watching her with a gaze that seemed to pierce through the storm. He didn't say a word, but he didn't need to. The quiet in the air spoke volumes. She dismounted, her legs stiff from the fall earlier, but she forced herself to move forward. The horse, still a comforting presence beneath her, followed her as she walked into the barn. The scent of hay and wood mixed with the earthy smell of rain-soaked ground. She could feel the weight of every step she took, the silence stretching out between them like an unspoken understanding. The stable hand was waiting near the far side of the barn, where the horses were kept, his back turned as he tended to one of the stalls. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more here, something that had yet to be revealed. "You did well out there," he said quietly, without turning around. His voice, though calm, carried an edge that made her pause. But the storm wasn't just a storm. "You've felt it, haven't you?" Her pulse quickened, and she nodded slowly, though the words escaped her. She had felt it, the unease, the pressure, the strange force that had drawn her to this moment. The events earlier had felt surreal, like a dream, but the feeling in her chest told her that this wasn't over. Something had shifted, and she had no idea what was waiting on the other side. He turned then, his eyes intense and full of something she couldn't name. "There's more to this place than you realize. More to those horses, and more to you than you've ever known." Her heart raced as she tried to make sense of his words. More to the horses? More to her? She had thought the chaos had subsided, that she had finally faced her fears and overcome the storm. But now, standing in the barn with the stable hand's cryptic words hanging in the air, she realized that the path ahead was more uncertain than ever. She took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. "What do you mean? What is this place?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, but determined to hear the truth. The stable hand's expression softened, a look of sadness creeping into his eyes. "This land," he began, taking a step closer, "has always had a connection to the horses that live here. They're not just animals, they're guardians, protectors of a deeper secret. And so are you." Her mind spun, unable to process his words fully. She had always loved horses, but to think of them as guardians, protectors, it didn't seem possible. Her gaze dropped to her horse, who stood quietly nearby, his calm presence a sharp contrast to the growing sense of tension in the barn. She had always felt a bond with him, but the idea of there being more to their connection made her head spin. "The storm," the stable hand continued, "wasn't just a weather pattern. It was a warning. A test. And you passed it. You've been chosen." She swallowed hard, trying to steady her racing thoughts. Chosen? Chosen for what? And why now? All the pieces seemed to be falling into place, but there was still so much she didn't understand. He stepped forward, his face serious. "There's something about you, something inside you, that's always been connected to this land. To these horses. Your bond with them isn't accidental. They'd been waiting for someone who could hear their call, someone who could understand them on a deeper level. And now you're ready?" She took a step back, her breath caught in her throat. "Ready for what? What are you talking about?" The stable hand didn't immediately answer. Instead, he looked toward the back of the barn, where the shadows seemed to gather, dark and thick. "There's a power here. A force that's been dormant for generations. The horses, the land, they've kept it safe, protected it from those who would exploit it. But it's time for a new guardian, someone who can hold the key to what lies beneath." Her mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of what he was saying. She had felt the pull, the connection to the horses, but to think there was some deeper, hidden power in this place, it was overwhelming. "I don't understand," she murmured, almost to herself. "What is this key? What's hidden here?" He was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was almost a whisper. The storm was the beginning. The next part is up to you. You'll need to make a choice, and it will change everything. Her heart skipped a beat as he turned, moving to the farthest stall in the barn. She followed, the air thick with anticipation. The horse in that stall was unlike any other. He stood tall, his coat shimmering even in the dim light, his eyes wise and ancient, as if they had seen centuries pass. There was an aura about him, something powerful and profound. "This is the leader," the stable hand explained, his voice reverberating with reverence. "He's the one who holds the key. But he won't let anyone close unless they're worthy. He's been waiting for you." She stared at the horse, her heart pounding as the realization hit her. This wasn't just about her fear of riding. This was about something much larger. A destiny she hadn't known she was a part of. She had been chosen not just by the horses, but by the land itself. The storm had been a test, and now, standing before this magnificent creature, she understood that her journey was just beginning. Without thinking, she stepped closer to the horse, her hand outstretched. The horse's gaze met hers, steady and calm, and for the first time, she felt a wave of peace wash over her. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. As her fingers brushed against his coat, she felt a surge of energy, a connection unlike anything she had ever known. It was as if the world around her disappeared, leaving only her and the horse, their bond unbreakable. She understood now. This was her calling. This was her purpose. And in that moment, she knew that no matter what came next, she would face it with courage and strength. She wasn't alone anymore. The horses, the land, the storm, they had all led her here, to this moment, and now it was her turn to protect them, to protect the secret they had guarded for so long. The stable hand smiled, his eyes filled with quiet satisfaction. "You've found your place," he said softly. "You are the guardian now. And together you and the horses will keep this land safe." As she stood there, hand resting on the powerful horse before her, she knew her life had changed forever. She wasn't just a rider anymore. She was part of something greater. And whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them with the strength of the horses, the storm, and the land at her back. The journey had only just begun.